Mr. Secretary, when is this going to get better? You came into this job saying you were going to fight crime. Have you been successful? Found a way to put that.
Can you update us on the status of negotiations?
Sometimes the news can be difficult and overwhelming for kids to understand, so we've created a newscast just for them. We hope your family will watch Nightly News Kids Edition.
Celebrating 75 years of Meet the Press, the longest running show on television.
The world is watching what we do here.
We all have a duty to ensure that what happened on January 6th never happens again.
I did not see evidence of fraud.
Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us.
I think he ultimately knew that his fidelity to the Constitution was his first and foremost oath.
I'm the American president. Take me up to the Capitol now.
We have sufficient information to consider criminal referrals for multiple individuals.
This is an NBC News special report, the January 6th committee's final presentation. Here now is Lester Holt.
Good day, everyone. A year-and-a-half-long investigation that included more than 1,200 witnesses, 1 million pages of records, and 9 public hearings reaches its conclusion. The January 6th committee will present its closing arguments today ahead of the release of its final report. But the big headline likely to emerge out of today's presentation would be the vote expected at the end of it, a vote to refer criminal charges against former President Donald Trump. NBC News has learned those charges are likely to include obstructing an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the government, and inciting or assisting an insurrection. That in and of itself would be unprecedented. A congressional body recommending criminal charges against a former president. It will then be up to the Department of Justice whether to pursue those charges. Remember, it would be just a recommendation. Let's go right to our senior Capitol Hill correspondent, Garrett Hake, who was just outside the hearing room. Garrett, lay out the day for us. What can we expect as this committee meets?
Well, Lester, the closing argument metaphor here is appropriate. This committee has been working for 18 months. They've conducted more than 1,000 interviews, sifted through 1 million pages of records. They're going to try to condense their work, including those hearings we saw over the spring and summer, into about an hour and a half long presentation here today, summarizing their key facts and particularly laying responsibility, accountability, the committee will say, for the attack on the Capitol at the feet of the former president. You laid out those referrals. Our team reporting overnight the 3 at least criminal referrals for the former president. That work, too, has been a long time coming. The committee started out with a theory of Donald Trump's culpability. Of course, all these members had already voted for his impeachment in the House of Representatives, and then really put meat on the bones as they continued to investigate this, arguing at times before a federal judge that they thought the former president was legally culpable. So that vote here today will likely produce the headlines, and from my reporting on the Trump campaign, will produce a response from the former president, who has refused to engage with the committee's subpoenas, but has taken shots at their work for the duration, Lester.
And Garrett, it always felt during the hearings that this committee was bumping up against a potential deadline, that being the outcome of the election. We know Republicans will take control of the House in January. So where does that leave all this?
Well, Lester, the committee is going to hurry after this vote today to get as much of their work product into the public eye as possible. They're hoping to get the full report released by Wednesday. They want to get as many of the transcripts, appendices, really all the work that they've done out into the public, because, as you say, this committee ceases to exist at the end of this year. In fact, a new Republican Congress could even come in and effectively turn off their website, taking that material down. That's why they felt that even having a hearing, or a meeting rather, today in public was important to continue to try to push this information out into the spotlight.
All right, Garrett, thanks. We'll be talking to you as our coverage continues this afternoon. Let me bring in NBC Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander and NBC News Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor. Peter, what does the White House hope to hear today?
Well, I think the White House, obviously, to this point, Lester, in my conversations with officials here, and as we have witnessed, has tried to be particularly careful and intentional to let the committee do its investigative work independently, even to avoid the appearance of interfering in any form here. But obviously, President Biden and his aides will be watching very closely the final outline in the meeting today and the final report when it comes out on Wednesday. And I think in speaking to folks here, they really view this sort of as punctuating what has been the president's message, really the motivation, the justification for him running for office, which was at the January 6th committee. It was sort of a continuation of his, as he described it, battle for the soul of the nation. He has not shied away from speaking out about the attack. President Biden made it very clear his view of that attack and the threat to democracy in the waning days of the midterms. They feel like that message was validated by voters, though Democrats will lose their hold on the House. They gained a seat in the Senate. Those candidates who had been endorsed or campaigned or had Donald Trump campaigning with them, in many cases, they lost. Republicans broadly underperformed or struggled in many places. Dr. Oz among them in Pennsylvania, Herschel Walker in Georgia as well. So the White House feels like this message still resonates, and they're hopeful, I think, that this will be an effective communicated message today, but it's one that they're going to try to steer clear of interfering with in any form.
All right, Peter, let me turn to you, Misha. Misha, I think a lot of Americans would be forgiven for feeling they have heard this before, that they felt like this committee probably already wrapped up its work that we heard in that last hearing. In terms of connecting to the everyday person, do they need to deliver a surprise or a bombshell, or what are they up against?
Well, Lester, it's a great question. This is really a committee that is facing high expectations because, as you said, the American public has seen them in a number of other hearings, and of course, this being a business meeting. But they've really laid out their case to the American public in a number of ways. Of course, what's different about this meeting is that there is expected to be these criminal referrals, and that's going to be new. That's going to be something historic, where you're seeing a congressional committee saying that they recommend to the Department of Justice to pursue charges against a former president, and not just for anything. It's for what they say is really trying to bring American democracy to its knees. I also think there are political implications here. We just went through a midterm season and cycle where members of this committee lost their positions, lost their bids for re-election. Chief among them, Liz Cheney, who's a Republican, of course, on this committee, one of only two, who decided that she was in some ways going to stake her political career on making the case that this had to be country over party. She made the case over and over again that Donald Trump was a singular danger to American democracy. She also had to go back to Wyoming and make the case to her constituents that the work that she was doing, the time that she was spending, that was in their best interest. She ultimately lost her re-election bid. You also have a Democrat, Elaine Luria, in Virginia, who also lost a pretty competitive and hard election. That being said, as Peter was just in some ways alluding to, election deniers overall, did not fare well in this last election. Most competitive races of the election denier lost. But Lester, something that's really, really important, when this committee comes to a close, because Republicans are going to be taking over control in the House, there are going to be dozens of election deniers who are going to be sitting in congressional seats. When you think about the fact that dozens and dozens of Republicans across this country, that they ran by questioning or denying outright the outcome of the 2020 election, it tells you that the issues that the committee is dealing with right now, they're going to continue into next year. So connecting with everyday people, it's going to be that the person who might be representing your district might be going up against some of the things that this committee is talking about, going up against the idea that a sitting president and a former president, that they should not call into question an election like 2020, where you didn't see broad voter fraud, where in fact you saw a number of agencies saying this was a secure election. So a lot at stake here, and a lot, I think, for the committee to put forward in front of the American people.
And Yamiche, I know there was some concern that this report may not go deeply into ancillary issues about January 6th regarding security, regarding what officials knew and expected and how they prepared. Is that going to come back to haunt the committee in terms of their focus?
Well, I think there's part of this committee is how did this all happen? I think that if the Republicans were definitely, I think this was a split that you saw among Democrats and Republicans. Republicans really wanted to focus on how did the security happen? How come there wasn't more police there? How come there might have been, they say, especially Republicans were making the argument that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi might be to blame for the way that the protesters were able to access the building. But Democrats wanted to say this was not a spontaneous protest. I think that's been the chief argument of this committee. This was part of a plan, a meticulously planned effort by the former President Donald Trump to usurp democracy, to hold on to power, to have an attempted coup. So I think for among committee members, their work was set out to speak to history and to say never again should a former president or a sitting president try to hold on to power when the American people have voted them out of office. So I think it's going to be something that definitely is going to have some tension between Republicans and Democrats. But I think the committee overall, and talking to my sources, they feel pretty solid about the work that they've done, even if the DOJ, which is of course a big question here, even if the DOJ doesn't follow through with their criminal referrals, because as we know, those criminal referrals, they don't have any legal standing. They're simply Congress saying, we think you should do this. Right. But these committee members wanted to make sure that they underscored what they saw as the most dangerous parts of this Capitol attack.
And I want to continue with that point with our justice correspondent, Ken Delaney. And we keep hearing about these referrals that we expect will come down today, that they have no legal power. And it obviously leads to the next question. So what is the point?
Yeah, I think we cannot emphasize that enough, Lester, that these are entirely symbolic, have no legal meaning, and in fact, we don't expect the Justice Department to comment on them. The special counsel, Jack Smith, when he was appointed in November, said that he would conduct these two investigations independently, but that's the point. There already are extensive ongoing criminal investigations, including into this question of whether Donald Trump violated the law in connection with the Capitol riot or in connection with these broader efforts to overturn the election, and those will continue. And I think what's interesting about the criminal referral is this use of the insurrection statute, which is not a statute that has been used in any of the Capitol riot cases, including against the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. They've been charged instead with seditious conspiracy. And there's some legal analysis out there that insurrection could be easier to prove in a case against former President Trump because it doesn't require that prosecutors prove that he entered into a conspiracy. But the fact that it hasn't been used suggests that prosecutors see maybe some challenges with that Civil War era statute. Also, interestingly, anyone convicted of insurrection is technically barred from holding federal office, although there are some questions about whether that could be enforced when it comes to a presidential candidate. And lastly, we can expect Donald Trump to, if he ever is charged and is on trial, he's going to argue that he had no criminal intent because he was following the advice of lawyers. So that's a hurdle that the Department of Justice will have to overcome, because we know from the January 6th investigation that there were lawyers, some of whom may be charged themselves, who were arguing to Donald Trump that the election was filled with fraud and that Mike Pence, for example, could stop the count that day. So prosecutors have a much greater hurdle than the members of Congress who are writing up these criminal referrals today. And Lester, just to drill down on the question you asked Yamiche, because one of the founding principles of this committee, one of its purposes, was to get to the bottom of why this attack was able to happen, why it wasn't stopped by law enforcement, given that there was a lot of intelligence on social media suggesting that violent people were coming to the Capitol on January 6th. And we've reported, our sources have told us that some of that stuff may be left out of this report. And if so, that's going to be a huge missed opportunity for this committee, Lester.
All right, Ken, we will ask you to stand by. We want to remind our viewers to stay with us. We've got more special coverage of the January 6th committee's final presentation. More NBC News Daily right after this. Mr. Secretary, when is this going to get better? You came into this job saying you were going to fight crime. Have you been successful? Found a way to put that. Can you update us on the status of negotiations?
Celebrating 75 years of Meet the Press, the longest running show on television.
Sometimes the news can be difficult and overwhelming for kids to understand, so we've created a newscast just for them. We hope your family will watch Nightly News Kids Edition.
Welcome back to our special coverage as we await the final presentation from the January 6th committee. We're going to talk more about those expected criminal referrals coming at the end of the meeting, what they could be and whether they could result in actual criminal investigations and prosecutions. Let's go right to the NBC News legal analyst, Danny Savalos, and former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Danny, first of all, what could these referrals mean from a legal standpoint? I think it's been clearly established there's no legal binding to these, but there has to be something motivating it.
Arguably, you could say it means very little to the president, and maybe that's how he'll play it, because it's not a binding requirement. And I expect you're going to hear DOJ at some point come out and say, even though we have this referral, we are an independent agency, we are a separate branch, we make all prosecution decisions independently on our own, irrespective of a referral from Congress. But I do expect DOJ will be happy to receive the evidence, and you can expect, I think, that most of the most damning evidence Congress has already put into its presentation. So DOJ may accept that, but at the same time, DOJ has investigative powers that the January 6th committee can't even come close to. And DOJ doesn't announce its investigation. So they may have plenty of information that we don't even know about. As we've seen, the January 6th committee has struggled with even enforcing its own subpoenas. DOJ typically doesn't have that same challenge. So if there is an investigation, they may find the January 6th materials helpful, but I am certain that they are more than capable of conducting their own investigation and may have everything January 6th committee has already and then some.
Chuck, let me turn to you. Viewers who have followed these hearings with us are well aware we would constantly remind people this is not a trial, the evidence is being laid out sometimes without exculpatory evidence. So given that, how effective is the material that was gathered and some of what we refer to as the bombshell testimony during this process?
Yeah, I think of it this way, Lester. The committee made a good presentation. They didn't come close to proving a criminal case the way the Department of Justice would have to do in federal court. To your point, there's no judge, there's no defense attorney, there's no cross-examination, there's no rules of evidence, there's no rules of criminal procedure. And so it's one thing to present in a committee setting some compelling testimony that they found during their investigation. Quite another, and Danny was making this point as well, quite another to do that in a federal criminal court where you have to convince a jury unanimously, and the standard would be, of course, by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So, did the committee do a good job in its presentation? Yes. Does that constitute all of the things necessary to prove a case in federal court? Absolutely not. There's a huge gulf between those two things.
Yeah, and that's what I'm getting at, the sense that there were a lot of moments that, we saw witnesses with some very compelling testimony, as we said, bombshell. But as you watched over these many months, are some of the things we saw things that would maybe never even make it into a criminal case, that may be argued inadmissible or hearsay?
Let me give you an example. So the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson, which many of your viewers will recall, was compelling. She was repeating things that had been told to her. She could be both completely honest and wrong. And that happens often when you're dealing with things that are hearsay in federal court. Hearsay would be something, Lester, that I told you that you repeated in court. You may not have witnessed it. You may not have firsthand knowledge of it. You're faithfully repeating to the jury what it is you heard from me. In many instances, in most instances, Lester, that's inadmissible hearsay. It's just one example. So again, quite different to present something in a committee setting as opposed to proving it in federal court. I think Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony illustrates that gulf, that chasm, quite well, because again, she could be honest, she could be faithful in her recounting, but what she is repeating would not be admissible under the federal rules of evidence.
All important things to keep in mind as we watch this presentation about to be made in Washington. We're going to pause now for a quick break. We'll be back ahead of the January 6th meeting. More NBC News Daily right after this.
Watch NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt or listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Sometimes the news can be difficult and overwhelming for kids to understand.
Ukraine and Russia. Could you help me understand what's going on?
So to help make sense of it all, we've created a newscast just for them. We hope your family will watch Nightly News Kids Edition.
Celebrating 75 years of Meet the Press, the longest running show on television.
Welcome back. We're just minutes away from the January 6th committee's final presentation, where they are expected to vote on something historic, whether to recommend criminal charges to the Department of Justice against a former president. We underline recommend. Joining us now is senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, explain the significance of what could happen here.
Well, it's a good question, Lester, because so much of what is happening is we're looking now at the live shot of that hearing room, and Officer Harry Dunn, who has been at all of the January 6th hearings so far, is now at this meeting as well. You can see the audience now starting to file in. Significance-wise, as it relates to, let's say, former President Donald Trump, Lester, I've been talking with folks in Trump world about this over the last 24 hours. They have a sense that, in the words of one source I spoke with, the cake is pretty baked on this front. In other words, there has been so much information that has come out over the last several months from this committee that people pretty much know where they stand. Either you are interested in this and you care, or you have your mind made up. And this is something that you also see, if you are a supporter of the former president, likely as a partisan, in the words of the Trump team, a partisan situation here. There's even the sense, and listen, let's be clear, Lester, that the spin machine is whirling as we speak, right? But I've heard from some folks in the orbit who suggest that maybe a criminal referral could actually work in the former president's favor, and that they could then seize on that and and describe it as they've done before, a kangaroo court, partisan, trying to portray this as Congress and the DOJ playing politics around former President Trump. That is a kind of victimization that he has used in the past to try to rally members of his base. So when you look at kind of the political significance, Lester, I think that's it. The question is, like, what has teeth, right? Like, what could really have teeth from this hearing? As we know, these referrals are largely symbolic. That gets to the question of, and you've had these conversations here in this special coverage so far, could he be barred from holding further office if, in fact, the DOJ does pick up an indictment and he gets convicted of an insurrection of that statute? That is a ways off, Lester.
But there are questions reminding he's not just a former president, he is a presidential candidate. Does any of this potentially affect his 2024 bid?
It's a good question because as you look ahead, right, he has done not much on the campaign front over the last month since he's announced, other than pull out some, trading cards with his face on it that I can tell you have confused and annoyed some people, even in Trump world, of why he'd take that step. That said, he has he's got to fend off potentially other Republicans who also want the presidential nomination. None of them have officially announced it yet, Lester, but you have to think that those announcements are coming. They are on the way. That's where this potentially matters, right? Because the idea that Donald Trump is the victim of some kind of a partisan investigation has been around since as long as Donald Trump has been in the White House, right, over the last 5 years or so. That is not new. So again, I think that's where the baked cake theory comes in, that's pretty much part of the equation for people who have decided to support Donald Trump. The question that I have as it relates to 2024 is how will other potential Republican candidates who are also vying for the White House try to use this and point to this as they initiate their run?
Hallie, thanks. Let me turn to Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Hake. He's outside the hearing room. And Garrett, as we've been talking, we've been showing on the left side of the screen people gathering in the hearing room, including members of law enforcement, members of the Capitol Police, Metropolitan Police, who were directly affected and involved in the events of that day. What's the color, I guess, is my question, of what's happening in the room right now?
Well, Lester, there's something of a weighty mood here, for this Congress, for folks who won election in 2020. January 6th is all they've known of their service in Washington. Remember, it was the first day for many of these lawmakers on Capitol Hill when the attack occurred. And this investigation has hung over almost the entirety of that time. That's true for lawmakers. That's true for some of these police officers. There are some, like Harry Dunn, who you can probably see in the room, who've been in every single one of these hearings and public meetings. There are lawmakers who have been in every single one of these hearings or public meetings. They have wanted to see this through. And the fact that this meeting is coming today on the last week in session for this Congress and the last week in which Democrats control Congress, I think adds to the sense of finality here. January 6th, the 2-year anniversary, is coming up just a few weeks away. There's nothing announced or programmed by the incoming Republican House majority. It's likely that day will go without much remarked upon by the new speaker and the new majority. And so I think the sense today of a finality, of a summation, and of perhaps an opportunity to kind of put this behind this Congress, depending on the way you choose to look at it, hangs over all of these proceedings here today. Lester?
If, as expected, there are referrals at the end of this meeting, how did we get here? Was there disagreement with members of the panel? How did they work their way through them?
Well, I think a key moment in coming to that decision was the opinion by Judge David Carter a few months ago in their effort to get these emails from John Eastman. That was the first time in which a federal judge put pen to paper to say that he believed their preponderance of evidence indicated that Donald Trump had committed at least one, perhaps two crimes, two federal crimes. The committee really seized on that in their public comments and privately, and actually deputized a subcommittee of some of the attorneys who make up this committee to go through and see whether they could find legal justification to make these referrals. We know there's been some debate behind the scenes among committee members about how far to go, not just with Donald Trump, but whether those referrals should extend to other people who are involved in January 6th and its lead up, whether they should make broad criminal referrals. But the committee and its makeup of 7 Democrats and 2 Republicans have really valued their unanimity. They believe that that's been key to the successes that they've had in rallying people around this issue and in keeping the focus on their work. And they were not going to come forward and present anything except a united front. And so I think it'll be interesting to see, exactly how they couch the referrals that they make and the ones that they don't make. But I fully expect today and going forward, we're going to hear, in at least their on-the-record comments, a united front from this committee about how they got here and where they think the DOJ should go with their referrals.
Garrett, hey, thank you. As we have just moments away from this hearing getting getting underway. It's set to begin in just a moment. We want to right now pause briefly to give our NBC stations across the country a chance to join our coverage.
This is an NBC News special report. The January 6th committee's final presentation. The culmination of a year-and-a-half-long investigation. More than 1,000 witnesses.
I'm the acting president. Take me up to the Capitol now.
And hundreds of hours of video.
He's become detached from reality, if he really believes this stuff.
All leading up to the release of their final report. And a historic vote that could lead to criminal charges.
We have sufficient information to consider criminal referrals for multiple individuals.
Today, the January 6th committee makes its closing arguments to the American people. Here now is Lester Holt.
Good day, everyone. We're coming on the air with live coverage of the final presentation by the January 6th committee, set to begin momentarily. Today is not only their closing arguments to the American people, summarizing their conclusions after a year-and-a-half-long investigation, but there will also be a historic vote. The committee is expected to vote to refer criminal charges against former President Donald Trump to the Department of Justice. NBC News has learned those charges are likely to include obstructing an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the government, and inciting or assisting an insurrection. We should note those referrals are not legally binding, simply recommendations, but would represent that what they believe that there is sufficient evidence for charges to be brought. The committee has been working against the clock in many ways this whole time. In the new year, Republicans will control Congress, and this committee is expected to be dissolved. There will be no live testimony today. Instead, the committee will present an overview of their findings, with each of the 9 members taking their turn detailing a different part of their forthcoming report. I want to go right to our senior Capitol Hill correspondent, Garrett. Hey, Garrett, first tackle this issue of referral of charges today, what that's all about.
Well, Lester, these referrals are really the culmination of nearly 2 years of investigatory work, 18 months by this committee, plus a few months of just getting off the ground here. Remember, this all started with the impeachment of the former president. Then the committee formed and dug into their work in earnest over the summer previously. They had long believed that Donald Trump had committed crimes, both in the lead up to January 6th and in his conduct on that day. And over the course of the last few months, they have been discussing amongst themselves exactly where they felt they had the evidence to make these referrals to the Department of Justice. As you pointed out, they've settled on at least 3 specific charges: obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and incitement of insurrection. Now, these were conversations that were going on even as late as yesterday, nailing down the specific referrals which the committee intends to make to the special counsel who's now in charge of this investigation. Of course, these referrals have no legal weight, but they will have historical significance. The committee is in many ways the first of many entities investigating the 6th to conclude their work. And they will do so today with this vote, not just on the referrals, but on the release of their report, which will largely mirror the public hearings that we have seen over the course of the last year and lay out everything from the theory behind the so-called Stop the Steal movement to efforts to undermine the election results at the Department of Justice to Donald Trump's conduct during the hours of the attack on the Capitol. The committee has long valued their unanimity. The 7 Democrats, 2 Republicans will present a united front again today, Lester, as they take their case to the American people for one final time in public.
And Garrett, as we wait the committee members to emerge from behind closed doors and take their seats, let me go to our justice correspondent, Ken Delaney. And Ken, we're reminded there is more than just January 6th on the DOJ's plate. There's also the question of the Mar-a-Lago documents as they come to be known. Does any of this, if there is a referral, does any of this complicate any of that for the DOJ?
It's not entirely clear, Lester. The Mar-a-Lago case is widely seen as a much more simple case for the DOJ to chew on, to make a prosecution decision. It's pretty straightforward. We know the classified documents were found at Donald Trump's residence. There is some question about what evidence the Justice Department has on obstruction of justice. But when they get that all sorted out, it seems like the real question in that case is whether the Justice Department decides to charge a former president in a case that most experts think many other government officials, former officials, would have been charged by now. It's pretty straightforward. This January 6th investigation that the Justice Department is conducting is another kind of animal. It's a sprawling, complex investigation involving a number of players, many of the same issues that were presented by this committee in those televised hearings. And that's why these criminal referrals are really about as symbolic as you can get. You know, criminal referrals can have some meaning when the Justice Department is learning about something for the first time. That happens occasionally, where an agency will send over a referral and the Justice Department is just learning about this conduct and they start an investigation. In this case, the January 6th investigation by the Justice Department is well and truly on its way. And in fact, some of the evidence produced in some of these congressional hearings appears to have contributed to accelerating that DOJ investigation, according to our reporting, and particularly influenced how Attorney General Merrick Garland viewed the conduct of Donald Trump, particularly that very compelling testimony by Cassidy Hutchinson. But that's the evidence. The evidence is very important. The referrals, which will be essentially a legal analysis about why members of the staff and members of this committee think that Donald Trump committed these crimes, that's really not something the DOJ is going to do much with. They have their own lawyers who are chewing on all this, and they're going to make their own charging decisions as an independent branch of government, Lester.
Yeah, Benny Thompson, the chairman, now leading the rest of the committee into the hearing room. The door open and they're all filing their way to their seats. Again, we don't expect bombshells in terms of new evidence. There'll be no live witnesses here. But it will be the final breakdown, the final report, if you will, preparation by this committee into this long investigation. We should remind you, these have been hearings like none other, to the extent that they have been produced largely for television. There were prime time hearings, if you'll recall. Heavy use of graphics, things that would hold people's attention, and as we said, very different than what we have seen before with many high-profile Washington hearings on difficult and controversial subjects. So again, we would expect this presentation to end with those referrals. They could go farther than what we have been able to report, but we will see. The gavel now falling.
A quorum being present, the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material presented during today's meeting, and further, its approval to release deposition material that accompanies release of the Select Committee's final report. Good afternoon, and may God bless the United States of America. To cast a vote in the United States is an act of faith and hope. When we drop that ballot in the ballot box, we expect the people named on the ballot are going to uphold their end of the deal. The winner swears an oath and upholds it. Those who come up short ultimately accept the results and abide by the rule of law. That faith in our system is the foundation of American democracy. If the faith is broken, so is our democracy. Donald Trump broke that faith. He lost the 2020 election and knew it. But he chose to try to stay in office through a multi-part scheme to overturn the results and block the transfer of power. In the end, he summoned a mob to Washington, and knowingly they were armed and angry, pointed them to the Capitol and told them to fight like hell. There's no doubt about this. This afternoon, my colleagues will present our key findings, reminding you of some of the information we presented in earlier hearings and telling you how it fits in our broader conclusions. Those conclusions have helped shape the committee's final report, which we'll adopt today pursuant to House Resolution 503, which establishes the Select Committee nearly a year and a half ago. I expect our final work will be filed with the Clerk of the House and made public later this week. Beyond that release, the Select Committee intends to make public the bulk of its non-sensitive records before the end of the year. These transcripts and documents will allow the American people to see for themselves the body of evidence we've gathered and continue to explore the information that has led us to our conclusions. This committee is nearing the end of its work. But as the country, we remain in strange and uncharted waters. We've never had a president of the United States stir up a violent attempt to block the transfer of power. I believe nearly 2 years later, this is still a time of reflection and reckoning. If we are to survive as a nation of laws and democracy, this can never happen again. How do we stop it? This committee will lay out a number of recommendations in its final report. But beyond any specific details and recommendations we present, there's one factor I believe is most important in preventing another January 6th: accountability. So today, beyond our findings, we will also show that evidence we've gathered points to further action beyond the power of this committee or the Congress to help ensure accountability under law. Accountability that can only be found in the criminal justice system. We have every confidence that the work of this committee will help provide a roadmap to justice, and that the agencies and institutions responsible for ensuring justice under the law will use the information we've provided to aid in their work. And for those of you who have followed this committee's work, I hope we've helped make clear that there's a broader kind of accountability. Accountability to all of you, the American people. The future of our democracy rests in your hands. It's up to the people of this country to decide who deserves the public trust, who will put fidelity to the Constitution and democracy above all else, who will abide by the rule of law, no matter the outcome. I'm grateful to the millions of you who followed this committee's work. I hope we lived up to our commitment to present the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. Let me say in closing, the women and men seated around me on this dais are public servants in the most genuine sense. They put aside politics and partisanship to ensure the success of this committee in providing answers to the American people. I especially want to thank and acknowledge our Vice Chair, who has become a true partner in this bipartisan effort, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming. And I also recognize her for any opening statement that she cared to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your tremendous leadership of this committee. I know we all have benefited greatly from your wisdom and your wise counsel, so thank you very much. In April of 1861, when Abraham Lincoln issued the first call for volunteers for the Union Army, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Fletcher Cheney, joined the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He fought through all 4 years of the Civil War, from Chickamauga to Stones River to Atlanta. He marched with his unit in the Grand Review of Troops up Pennsylvania Avenue in May of 1865, past a reviewing stand where President Johnson and General Grant were seated. Silas Canfield, the regimental historian of the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry, described the men in the unit this way. He said they had a just appreciation of the value and advantage of free government and the necessity of defending and maintaining it. And they enlisted, prepared to accept all the necessary labors, fatigues, exposures, dangers, and even death for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions. I have found myself thinking often, especially since January 6th, of my great-great-grandfather and all those in every generation who have sacrificed so much for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions. At the heart of our republic is the guarantee of the peaceful transfer of power. Members of Congress are reminded of this every day as we pass through the Capitol Rotunda. There, 8 magnificent paintings detail the earliest days of our republic. One, painted by John Trumbull, depicts the moment in 1793 when George Washington resigned his commission, handing control of the Continental Army back to Congress. Trumbull called this, quote, one of the highest moral lessons ever given the world. With this noble act, George Washington established the indispensable example of the peaceful transfer of power in our nation. Standing on the west front of the Capitol in 1981, President Ronald Reagan described it this way: the orderly transfer of authority as called for in the Constitution routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony that we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. Every president in our history has defended this orderly transfer of authority, except one. January 6, 2021 was the first time one American president refused his constitutional duty to transfer power peacefully to the next. In our work over the last 18 months, the Select Committee has recognized our obligation to do everything we can to ensure this never happens again. At the beginning of our investigation, we understood that tens of millions of Americans had been persuaded by President Trump that the 2020 election was stolen by overwhelming fraud. And we also knew this was flatly false. We knew that dozens of state and federal judges had addressed and resolved all manner of allegations about the election. Our legal system functioned as it should, but our president would not accept the outcome. Among the most shameful of this committee's findings was that President Trump sat in the dining room off the Oval Office watching the violent riot at the Capitol on television. For hours, he would not issue a public statement instructing his supporters to disperse and leave the Capitol, despite urgent pleas from his White House staff and dozens of others to do so. Members of his family, his White House lawyers, virtually all those around him knew that this simple act was critical. For hours, he would not do it. During this time, law enforcement agents were attacked and seriously injured. The Capitol was invaded, the electoral count was halted, and the lives of those in the Capitol were put at risk. In addition to being unlawful, as described in our report, this was an utter moral failure and a clear dereliction of duty. Evidence of this can be seen in the testimony of President Trump's own White House counsel and several other White House witnesses. No man who would behave that way at that moment in time can ever serve in any position of authority in our nation again. He is unfit for any office. The committee recognizes that our work has only begun. It's only the initial step in addressing President Trump's effort to remain in office illegally. Prosecutors are considering the implications of the conduct that we describe in our report, as are citizens all across our nation. In 1761, John Adams wrote, "The very ground of our liberties is the freedom of elections." Faith in our elections and the rule of law is paramount to our republic. Election deniers, those who refuse to accept lawful election results, purposely attack the rule of law and the foundation of our country. The history of our time will show that the bravery of a handful of Americans doing their duty saved us from an even more grave constitutional crisis. Elected officials, election workers, and public servants stood against Donald Trump's corrupt pressure. Many of our committee's witnesses showed selfless patriotism, and their words and courage will be remembered. The brave men and women of the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police, and all the other law enforcement officers who fought to defend us that day saved lives and our democracy. Finally, I wish to thank my colleagues on this committee. It has been a tremendous honor to serve with all of you. We have accomplished great and important things together, and I hope we have set an example. And I also want to thank all of those who have honorably contributed to the work of our committee and to our report. We have accomplished much over a short period of time. Many of you sacrificed for the good of our nation. You have helped make history, and I hope helped to right the ship. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. As you know, this is our final meeting of our committee. Over the course of the last year and a half, we presented evidence in 10 public hearings, testimony from our brave law enforcement officers, senior White House and campaign officials, and many others. Today, we are prepared to share our final findings with you. But before we do so, it's important to remember what we've learned, and critically, exactly what happened at the United States Capitol on January 6th. Without objection, I include in the record a video presentation of some of the key evidence our investigation has uncovered.
Officers on the ground, they were bleeding, they were throwing up. I mean, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
As I was swarmed by a violent mob, they ripped off my badge. They grabbed and stripped me of my radio. They seized ammunition that was secured to my body. They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects.
The key thing to do is to claim victory. No, we won. Fuck you. Sorry, over. We won. Yeah. You're wrong. Fuck you. Maybe.
Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence.
I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Art Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
I told him that I did believe, yes, that once those legal processes were run, if fraud had not been established, it had affected the outcome of the election. And unfortunately, I believed that what had to be done was concede the outcome.
What were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None.
So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
The numbers are the numbers. The numbers don't lie. We had many allegations, and we investigated every single one of them.
Did one of them make a comment that they didn't have evidence, but they had a lot of theories?
That was Mr. Giuliani.
And what exactly did he say, and how that come up?
My recollection, he said, we've got lots of theories, we just don't have the evidence. You're asking me to do something that's never been done in history, the history of the United States. And I'm going to put my state through that without sufficient proof.
It's a tape earlier in the day of Ruby Freeman and Shay Freeman Moss and one other gentleman quite obviously, surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they're vials of heroin or cocaine.
In one of the videos we just watched, Mr. Giuliani accused you and your mother of passing some sort of USB drive to each other. What was your mom actually handing you on that video?
A ginger mint. Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you? The President of the United States is supposed to represent every American, not to target one.
I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit.
He wanted to talk about that he thought the election had been stolen or was corrupt and that there was widespread fraud. And I had told him that our reviews had not shown that to be the case.
And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed.
Well, my first thought was, this is a terrible idea. Jeff Clark cannot be installed as acting Attorney General of the United States.
You ultimately told us that you described this meeting as not this meeting, the Georgia letter that was proposed as an effing murder-suicide pact. Do you remember using the term murder-suicide pact?
Yes.
Was it your impression that the Vice President had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the President, not just to the world through a Dear Colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
My view is that the Vice President didn't have the legal authority to do anything except what he did.
And I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the Vice President, acting as President of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And you said yes. I said, are you out of your effing mind?
The president was, all the attention was on what Mike would do or what Mike wouldn't do.
There's a telephone conversation between the president and the vice president, is that correct?
Yes.
The conversation was pretty heated.
Apologize for being impolite, but do you remember what she said? Her father called him
The P word. It was clear that it was escalating quickly. So then when that tweet, the Mike Pence tweet, was sent out, I remember us saying that was the last thing that needed to be tweeted at that moment. It felt like he was pouring gasoline on the fire by tweeting that.
It gained access to the second floor, and I've got public about 5 feet from me down here below.
Okay, copy. They are on the second floor, moving in now. We may want to consider getting out and leaving now. Copy.
The members of the VP detail at this time were starting to fear for their own lives. There were calls to say goodbye to family members, so on and so forth.
Approximately 40 feet. That's all there was. 40 feet between the vice president and the mob.
Donald Trump and his allies and supporters are a clear and present danger to American democracy.
We got derogatory information from OSIP suggesting that some very, very violent individuals were organizing to come to D.C.
As Mr. Giuliani and I were walking to his vehicles that evening, he looked at me and said something to the effect of, "Cass, are you excited for the 6th? It's going to be a great day." I remember looking at him and saying, "Rudy, could you explain what's happening on the 6th?" He had responded something to the effect of, "We're going to the Capitol. It's going to be great. The The president's going to be there. He's going to look powerful.
He personally asked for us to come to D.C. that day. And I thought, for everything he's done for us, if this is the only thing he's going to ask of me, I'll do it.
Well, basically, the president, got everybody riled up, told everybody to head on down. So we basically were just following what he said.
Within 15 minutes of leaving the stage, President Trump knew that the Capitol was besieged and under attack.
So are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Secretary of Defense that day?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Attorney General of the United States that day?
No.
Are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Secretary of Homeland Security that day?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Did you ever hear the the president ask for the National Guard? Did you ever hear the president ask for law enforcement response?
No. You got an assault going on the Capitol of the United States of America. There's nothing. No call. Nothing. Zero.
I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong.
You on the staff did not want people to leave the Capitol.
On the staff?
In the White House.
I can't think of anybody, on that day who didn't want people to get out of the Capitol, particularly once the violence started. No. I mean,
what about the president?
Yeah.
Well, she said the staff. So I answered.
No, I said in the White House.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I thought you said who else on the staff. I can't reveal communications, but obviously I think,
I said, good, John. Now I'm going to give you the best free legal advice you're ever getting in your life. Get a great effing criminal defense lawyer. You're going to need it.
General Flynn, do you believe in the peaceful transition of power in the United States of America?
Yes, sir.
Another officer unconscious. Charge.
I don't want to say the election is over. I just want to say Congress has certified the results without saying the election's over, okay?
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last 18 months, the Select Committee has conducted a congressional investigation of enormous scale, seeking to uncover the depth and breadth of ex-President Trump's multi-part plan to reverse the lawful outcome of the 2020 presidential election. We've compiled an immense volume of documents collected from countless individuals, law enforcement agencies, and federal and state authorities. Many of our efforts to get the evidence required litigation in federal court, including the U.S. Supreme Court. We've taken the testimony of hundreds of witnesses. Now, while we couldn't show them all during the hearings, we focused on those who were most central, including our ex-president's White House aides, his senior Department of Justice officials, and senior members of his campaign. Based on this assembled evidence, the Select Committee has reached a series of specific findings. Now, many of these findings pertain to what has been called the big lie, the enormous effort led by ex-President Trump to spread baseless accusations and misinformation in an attempt to falsely convince tens of millions of Americans that the election had been stolen from him. Beginning even before the election and continuing through January 6th and thereafter, Donald Trump purposely disseminated false allegations of fraud in order to aid his effort to overturn the 2020 election. Ex-President Trump's decision to declare victory falsely on election night wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was premeditated. The committee has evidence that ex-President Trump planned to declare victory and unlawfully to call for the vote counting to stop, and that he told numerous allies about his intent in the weeks before the election. The committee found that Mr. Trump raised hundreds of millions of dollars with false representations made to his online donors. The proceeds from his fundraising, we have learned, have been used in ways that we believe are concerning. In particular, the committee has learned that some of those funds were used to hire lawyers. We've also obtained evidence of efforts to provide or offer employment to witnesses. For example, one lawyer told a witness the witness could, in certain circumstances, tell the committee that she didn't recall facts when she actually did recall them. That lawyer also did not disclose who was paying for the lawyer's representation, despite questions from the client seeking that information. He told her, quote, "We're not telling people where funding is coming from right now." We've learned that a client was offered potential employment that would make her, quote, "financially very comfortable" as the date of her testimony approached by entities that were apparently linked to Donald Trump and his associates. These offers were withdrawn or didn't materialize as reports of the content of her testimony circulated. The witness believed this was an effort to affect her testimony, and we are concerned that these efforts may have been a strategy to prevent the committee from finding the truth. Throughout the post-election period, ex-President Trump was told repeatedly by his campaign advisors, government officials, and others there was no evidence to support his claims of election fraud. Even since our last hearing, the Select Committee has obtained testimony from new witnesses who've come forward to tell us about their conversations with ex-President Trump on this topic. Here is one of his senior advisors, Hope Hicks.
Seeing evidence of fraud on a scale that would have impacted the outcome of the election, and I was becoming increasingly concerned that we were damaging his legacy.
What did the president say in response to what you just described?
He said something along the lines of, nobody will care about my legacy if I lose. So that won't matter. The only thing that matters is winning.
Despite all that, he continued to purposely and maliciously make false claims, sometimes within a day of being told that a particular claim was false and unsupported by the evidence. By the time the Electoral College met to cast its votes on December 14th, 2020, a number of President Trump's senior staff, cabinet officials, and members of his family were urging him to facilitate a peaceful transition to the incoming administration. He disregarded their advice, and he continued to claim publicly that the election had been stolen from him. Numerous state and federal courts evaluated and rejected the Trump campaign's claims of voter fraud, including 11 judges appointed by ex-President Trump himself. Many of these courts issued scathing opinions, criticizing the lack of evidence that ex-President Trump and his allies had advanced to support their claims. Numerous individuals associated with these efforts have since acknowledged that they were unable to find sufficient evidence of fraud to affect the election results, including in testimony to this select committee. Still, ex-President Trump repeated those false claims and tried to convince his supporters the election was stolen. This was an attempt to justify overturning the lawful election results. Donald Trump knowingly and corruptly repeated election fraud lies, which incited his supporters to violence on January 6th. He continues to repeat his meritless claim that the election was stolen even today and continues to erode our most cherished and shared belief in free and fair elections. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Building on his constant repetition of the big lie, President Trump engaged in an unprecedented effort to obstruct the joint session on January 6th, the proceeding where his electoral loss would be certified by Congress. This effort began in part in the states, which hold, count, and ultimately determine the winners of presidential elections. Many state officials were targeted by President Trump and his campaign. The local election workers he accused baselessly of election fraud, the state officials he pressured to stop the count or to find votes that didn't exist, and the state legislative officials he urged to disregard the popular will of the voters and their oath of office in order to name him the winner instead. Here are the Select Committee findings about President Trump's state pressure campaign. President Trump and his enablers repeatedly pressured state officials to take action to overturn the results of the election. The most dramatic example of this campaign of coercion was the president's January 2nd, 2021 call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which the president urged the secretary to find 11,780 votes he needed to change the outcome in that state. During that call, President Trump again repeated conspiracy theories about the election that his own appointees at the Department of Justice had already debunked. Trump also made what Secretary Raffensperger apparently considered a threat, accurately considered a threat, suggesting that Raffensperger and his attorney, that they could be subject to criminal prosecution if they didn't follow through with his demands. Then, in repeated telephone calls and in-person meetings, Donald Trump pressured state elections officials and state legislators to alter official election results. But courageous public servants, including Republicans like Rusty Bowers, held firm and refused to put Donald Trump over their oath to the Constitution. When Donald Trump's pressure campaign did not achieve the results he wanted, he oversaw an effort to obtain and transmit false electoral college ballots to Congress and the National Archives. The false ballots were created by fake Republican electors on December 14th. At the same time, the actual certified electors in those states were meeting to cast their votes for President Biden. By that point in time, election-related litigation was over in all or nearly all of these states. And Trump campaign election lawyers realized that the fake slates were unjustifiable on any grounds and may be unlawful. In spite of these concerns and the concerns of individuals in the White House counsel's office, President Trump and others proceeded with this plan. The Select Committee has developed evidence that these intentionally false documents were transmitted to multiple officers of the federal government and were intended to interfere with the proper conduct of the joint session, where the existence of so-called competing slates of electors would serve as a pretext for legitimate electoral votes to be rejected. President Trump repeatedly attacked state and local officials who refused to do his bidding, as well as local elections workers who he baselessly accused of fraud. As Ruby Freeman and the testimony of other elections officials so powerfully demonstrated, the people who drew President Trump's ire or were the subject of his lies faced real-world consequences, including public harassment and death threats. Some of these elections workers and officials have been forced to leave their homes. Others have been forced to leave the jobs they loved. Take a listen to Ms. Freeman's story.
Now I won't even introduce myself by my name anymore. I get nervous when I bump into someone I know in the grocery store who says my name. I'm worried about who's listening. I get nervous when I have to give my name for food orders. I'm always concerned of who's around me. I've lost my name and I've lost my reputation.
The treatment of Ms. Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss and so many others around the country was callous, inhuman, inexcusable, and dangerous. And those responsible should be held accountable. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly one of the many important components of our federal government is the Department of Justice. It's the body that it's responsible for enforcing our laws and investigating criminal wrongdoing. For this reason, it's of the utmost importance that our Department of Justice operates as a fair and neutral body that enforces our federal laws without fear or without favor. It is this critical function that President Trump sought to corrupt, as he sought to use the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute purported election fraud and to help him convince the public that the election was stolen. The Select Committee has made the following findings with respect to the Department of Justice. In the weeks immediately following the 2020 election, Attorney General Bill Barr advised President Trump that the Department of Justice had not seen any evidence to support Trump's theory that the election was stolen by fraud. No evidence. Over the course of the 3 meetings in this post-election period, Attorney General Barr assured President Trump that the Justice Department was properly investigating claims of election fraud. He debunked numerous election fraud claims, many of which the president would then go on to repeat publicly. And he made clear that President Trump was doing, quote, a great disservice to the country by pursuing them. After Attorney General Barr's resignation, President Trump requested that the acting leadership of the department, Jeffrey Rosen and Richard Donahue, quote, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. In other words, just tell a small lie to put the facade of legitimacy on this lie, and the Republican congressman and I can distort and destroy and create doubt all ourselves. Between December 23rd and January 3rd, President Trump called or met with them nearly every day and was told repeatedly the department investigation showed no factual support for Trump's fraud allegations. Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue told him that the fraud claims were simply untrue. As Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue continued to resist, President Trump then tried to install a loyalist named Jeffrey Clark to lead the department as acting attorney general. On several occasions, Clark met with the president, apparently along with Representative Scott Perry, without authorization, promising to take the actions that Barr, Rosen, and Donahue had refused to take. In particular, Mr. Clark intended to send a letter that he had drafted with the help of a political appointee that the White House installed at DOJ with just weeks left in the administration. Mr. Clark intended to send the letter to officials in numerous states, informing them falsely, of course, that the department had identified significant concerns about the election results in their state and encouraging their state legislatures to come into special session to consider appointing Trump rather than Biden electors. Here's Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue describing his reaction to Mr. Clark's proposed letter.
Some drafting letters without the knowledge of what the department had actually done in terms of investigations, that he was being reckless. And I recall toward the end saying, what you're proposing is nothing less than the United States Justice Department meddling in the outcome of a presidential election.
Knowing that existing department leadership would not support his false election claims, President Trump offered Mr. Clark the job of acting Attorney General. In a dramatic January 3rd meeting in the Oval Office, Rosen Donahue, White House counsel Pat Cipollone, and White House lawyer Eric Hirschman strongly objected to the appointment of Jeffrey Clark as acting Attorney General. Mr. Clark pleaded his case and offered to send the letter that he had drafted. The White House counsel called the Clark letter, quote, a murder-suicide pact. Numerous White House and Department of Justice lawyers all threatened to resign if Mr. Clark was appointed. Donald Trump would be leading a graveyard. It was only after the threat of mass resignations that President Trump rescinded his offer to Mr. Clark. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Former President Trump's multi-part plan didn't stop with the states or with the Department of Justice. It touched nearly every component of our federal system, ranging from the courts to Congress to his own Vice President, Mike Pence. In the weeks before January 6th, Mr. Trump turned to the man who had served him loyally for 4 years. He embraced an illegal scheme proposed by John Eastman and others who concocted an unfounded legal theory that the vice president could reject Joe Biden's electoral votes during the joint session. When Vice President Pence and many others, including Trump's own lawyer, John Eastman, told him correctly that former President Trump spearheaded an unprecedented campaign to coerce him to do it anyway, ultimately culminating in a dangerous threat to Mr. Pence's life on January 6th. These are the Select Committee's findings with respect to the pressure campaign against the Vice President. John Eastman admitted in advance of the 2020 election that Mike Pence could not lawfully refuse to count official electoral votes. But he nevertheless devised a meritless proposal that deployed a combination of bogus election fraud claims and the fake electoral ballots to say that Mike Pence, presiding over the joint session, could reject legitimate electoral votes for President-elect Biden. But still, President Trump accepted and repeated Eastman's theory and used it to pressure the vice president to take unlawful action. In multiple heated conversations, President Trump directly pressured Vice President Pence to adopt the Eastman theory and either reject the electors or send them back to the state legislatures. The vice president consistently resisted and repeatedly told the president that he did not possess the authority to do what President Trump directed. This culminated in an angry phone call on the morning of January 6th between President Trump and Vice President Pence, during which the former president repeatedly berated Mr. Pence by cursing and leveling threats. White House staffer Nick Luna was one of the many witnesses who heard the call as it happened. Take a listen at Mr. Luna's testimony.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what did you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, my memory, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are a wimp, you'll be a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember. Something to the effect, the wording's wrong. I made the wrong decision 4 or 5 years ago.
In the face of the vice president's resistance, the former president and others exerted both private and public pressure to change his mind. In his speech on the Ellipse on the afternoon of January 6th, former President Trump told the crowd that Vice President Pence needed the courage to do what he has to do. Once the riot began, President Trump deliberately chose to issue a tweet attacking Mr. Pence, knowing that the crowd had already grown violent. Almost immediately thereafter, the crowd around the Capitol surged, and between 2:30 and 2:35 p.m., the Metropolitan Police line on the west front of the Capitol broke. This was the first time in MPD history that a line like this had broken. Rioters at the Capitol were heard chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," through the afternoon. As a result of this unrest, Vice President Pence was forced to flee to a secure location where he actively coordinated with law enforcement and other governmental officials to address the ongoing violence. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Murphy, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ultimately, President Trump did not succeed in bending state and federal officials to his will. At every turn, state officials, the Department of Justice, Mike Pence, and many others stood up for the rule of law and resisted the president's wishes. In that way, our American institutions held after the 2020 election. But that did not stop President Trump. Instead, he turned to his supporters, those who believed his lies about a stolen election. He summoned a crowd to the nation's capital on January 6, hoping that they would pressure Congress to do what he could not do on his own. The Select Committee has made the following findings on this issue. 2 years ago today, in the early morning hours of December 19th, Donald Trump sent a tweet urging his supporters to travel to Washington for a protest on January 6th. "Be there, we'll be wild," he tweeted. Between December 19th and January 6th, the president repeatedly encouraged his supporters to come to Washington. The president's December 19th tweet galvanized domestic violent extremists, including members of the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and organized militia groups. These individuals began organizing to come to the Capitol in large numbers with the specific intent to use violence to disrupt the certification of the election during the joint session. Prior to January 6th, the FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Capitol Police, D.C. government, and other law enforcement agencies gathered substantial evidence suggesting the risk of violence at the Capitol during the joint session. These included warnings like the following. Their plan is to literally kill people. Please take this tip seriously and investigate further. President Trump's supporters have proposed a movement to occupy Capitol Hill. Alert regarding the VP being a dead man walking if he doesn't do the right thing. I saw several other alerts saying they will storm the Capitol if he doesn't do the right thing. In the days leading up to January 6th, President Trump's advisors explicitly told him that he should encourage his supporters to be peaceful that day, but he refused. One witness, Hope Hicks, provided the committee with records of her text messages on January 6th. In one exchange with another staffer, he texted her, "Hey, I know you're seeing this, but he," referring to President Trump, "really should tweet something about being nonviolent." "I'm not there," Hicks replied. "I suggested it several times Monday and Tuesday, and he refused." When Ms. Hicks came in to provide testimony to the committee, we asked her about this exchange. Her explanation is that the "he" in this text wasn't the president, but rather it was Eric Hirschman. Take a listen to her testimony.
When you wrote, "I suggested it several times," and it presumably means that the president say something about being nonviolent. You wrote, "I suggested it several times Monday and Tuesday, and he refused." Tell us what happened.
Sure. I didn't speak to the president about this directly, but I communicated to people like Eric Hirschman that it was my view that it was important that the president put out some kind of message in advance of the event.
And what was Mr. Hirschman's response?
Mr. Hirschman said that he had made the same, recommendation directly to the president, and that he had refused.
Just so I understand, Mr. Hirschman said that he had already recommended to the president that the president convey a message that people should be peaceful on January 6th, and the president had refused to do that?
Yes.
The public will be able to review this in the transcripts and see the perspective Eric Hirschman gave before we took Hope Hicks's testimony. Despite having knowledge of the threats of violence presented by the crowd gathered on January 6th, President Trump gave an incendiary speech, declaring without basis that the election had been stolen and encouraging his supporters to fight like hell. And during the speech and immediately thereafter, President Trump stated his intention to travel to the Capitol with his supporters in an effort to influence the joint session. The Select Committee has developed evidence indicating that President Trump did, in fact, intend to go to the Capitol on the afternoon of January 6th, and that he repeatedly expressed that intention during the afternoon and in the days prior. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Virginia, Mrs. Luria, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All of President Trump's efforts came to a head on the afternoon of January 6th. Standing on the stage of the Ellipse, President Trump told tens of thousands of angry supporters that the election was stolen, that they had the power to change that if they marched to the Capitol, and that they wouldn't have a country anymore if the presidency was taken away from him. He told them he would be there with them. And then, as the crowd descended on the Capitol, President Trump watched it on television. Despite pleas from his senior advisors, from lawmakers on the Hill, and from his own children, President Trump would not issue a public statement instructing his supporters to disperse and leave the Capitol. Mr. Trump's failures spanned the period from 1:10 p.m., when his speech ended and he instructed his supporters to march to the Capitol, to 4:17 p.m., when he finally, begrudgingly, told his supporters to go home. For 187 minutes, he actively disregarded his constitutional obligation to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. As we've established through months of investigation, that is because the mob wanted what President Trump wanted, to impede the peaceful transition of power. These are the Select Committee's findings about President Trump's dereliction of duty. From the outset of the violence, and for several hours that followed, people at the Capitol, people inside President Trump's administration, elected officials of both parties, members of President Trump's own family, and even Fox News commentators who were sympathetic to President Trump, all tried to contact the White House to urge him to do one singular thing. The one thing that all of these people immediately understood was required: instruct his supporters to leave the Capitol. The president repeatedly refused pleas as he watched the violence at the Capitol on television. During the day, the president never spoke with National Guard, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, or any law enforcement agency. At no point during the day, or any other, did he issue any order to deploy any law enforcement agency to assist. Multiple witnesses, including President Trump's White House counsel, testified to these facts. Your White House employees, who had been speaking directly with President Trump, state that he didn't want anything done. The president was making phone calls that afternoon, but they weren't to law enforcement officials. Rather, President Trump continued to call his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Both President Trump and Mr. Giuliani spoke with congressional leaders, even after the violence had begun, to encourage them to continue delaying the session. Approximately 3 hours after being informed of the violence at the Capitol, hours during which, as our evidence has shown, Donald Trump sat in his dining room and watched the violence on television, the president released a video statement in which he again repeated that the election was stolen, told his supporters at the Capitol that he loved them, and ultimately suggested that they disperse. This statement had an immediate impact on elements of the crowd, many of whom have testified that it led them to depart the Capitol. At 6:01 p.m., President Trump sent his last tweet of the day. He did not condemn the violence. Instead, he attempted to justify it. These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away, he wrote. Remember this day forever. There's no doubt that President Trump thought that the actions of the rioters were justified. In the days after January 6th, he spoke to several different advisors. And in those conversations, he minimized the seriousness of the attack. Here's new testimony from another one of President Senior's advisors, Kellyanne Conway.
You said you talked to the president the next day. Tell us about that conversation on the 7th.
Yeah,
I don't think it was very long. I just said that was just a terrible day. I'm working on a long statement. I said it's crazy.
What did he say?
No, these people are upset. They're very upset.
In the days following the attack, President Trump also expressed a desire to pardon those involved in the attack. Since then, he's suggested that he will do so if he returns to the Oval Office. In summary, President Trump lit the flame, he poured gasoline on the fire, and sat by in the White House dining room for hours watching the fire burn. And today, he still continues to fan those flames. That was his extreme dereliction of duty. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for the opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership of this committee. Generations to come will praise you and the Vice Chair for your unswerving devotion to the rule of law. Several months ago, you tasked several of our members in a subcommittee with bringing recommendations to the full committee about potential referrals to the Department of Justice and other authorities based on evidence of criminal and civil offenses that has come to our attention over the course of our investigation. We are now prepared to share those recommendations today. Mr. Chairman, let me begin with some relevant background considerations to our criminal referrals. The dangerous assault on American constitutional democracy that took place on January 6, 2021 consists of hundreds of individual criminal offenses. Most such crimes are already being prosecuted by the Department of Justice. We propose to the committee advancing referrals where the gravity of the specific offense, the severity of its actual harm, and the centrality of the offender to the overall design of the unlawful scheme to overthrow the election compel us to speak. Ours is not a system of justice where foot soldiers go to jail and the masterminds and ringleaders get a free pass. Mr. Chairman, as you know, our committee had the opportunity last spring to present much of our evidence to a federal judge, something that distinguishes our investigation from any other congressional investigation I can recall. In the context of resolving evidentiary privilege issues related to the crime fraud doctrine in the Eastman case, U.S. District Court Judge David Carter examined just a small subset of our evidence to determine whether it showed the likely commission of a federal offense. The judge concluded that both former President Donald Trump and John Eastman likely violated 2 federal criminal statutes. This is the starting point for our analysis today. The first criminal statute we invoke for referral, therefore, is Title 18, Section 1512C, which makes it unlawful for anyone to corruptly obstruct, influence, or impede any official proceeding of the United States government. We believe that the evidence described by my colleagues today and assembled throughout our hearings warrants a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violations of this statute. The whole purpose and obvious effect of Trump's scheme were to obstruct, influence, and impede this official proceeding, the central moment for the lawful transfer of power in the United States. Second, we believe that there is more than sufficient evidence to refer former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violating Title 18, Section 371. This statute makes it a crime to conspire to defraud the United States. In other words, to make an agreement to impair, obstruct, or defeat the lawful functions of the United States government by deceitful or dishonest means. Former President Trump did not engage in a plan to defraud the United States acting alone. He entered into agreements, formal and informal, with several other individuals who assisted him with his criminal objectives. Our report describes in detail the actions of numerous co-conspirators who agreed with and participated in Trump's plan to impair, obstruct, and defeat the certification of President Biden's electoral victory. That said, the subcommittee does not attempt to determine all of the potential participants in this conspiracy, as our understanding of the role of many individuals may be incomplete even today because they refuse to answer our questions. We trust that the Department of Justice will be able to form a far more complete picture through its own investigation. Third, we make a referral based on Title 18, Section 1001, which makes it unlawful to knowingly and willfully make materially false statements to the federal government. The evidence clearly suggests that President Trump conspired with others to submit slates of fake electors to Congress and the National Archives. We believe that this evidence we set forth in our report is more than sufficient for a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump and others in connection with this offense. As before, we don't try to determine all of the participants in this conspiracy, many of whom refuse to answer our questions while under oath. We trust that the Department of Justice will be able to form a more complete picture through its own investigation. The fourth and final statute we invoke for referral is Title 18, Section 2383. The statute applies to anyone who incites, assists, or engages in insurrection against the United States of America, and anyone who gives aid or comfort to an insurrection. An insurrection is a rebellion against the authority of the United States. It is a grave federal offense anchored in the Constitution itself, which repeatedly opposes insurrections and domestic violence, and indeed uses participation in insurrection by office holders as automatic grounds for disqualification from ever holding public office again at the federal or state level. Anyone who incites others to engage in rebelling, assists them in doing so, or gives aid and comfort to those engaged in insurrection is guilty of a federal crime. The committee believes that more than sufficient evidence exists for a criminal referral of former President Trump for assisting or aiding and comforting those at the Capitol who engaged in a violent attack on the United States. The committee has developed significant evidence that President Trump intended to disrupt the peaceful transition of power under our Constitution. The president has an affirmative and primary constitutional duty to act to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Nothing could be a greater betrayal of this duty than to assist in insurrection against the constitutional order. The complete factual basis for this referral is set forth in detail throughout our report. These are not the only statutes that are potentially relevant to President Trump's conduct related to the 2020 election. Depending on evidence developed by the Department of Justice, the president's actions could certainly trigger other criminal violations. Nor are President Trump and his immediate team the only people identified for referrals in our report. As part of our investigation, we asked multiple members of Congress to speak with us about issues critical to our understanding of this attack on the 2020 election and our system of constitutional democracy. None agreed to provide that essential information. As a result, we took the significant step of issuing them subpoenas based on the volume of information particular members possessed about one or more parts of President Trump's plans to overturn the election. None of the subpoenaed members complied, and we are now referring 4 members of Congress for appropriate sanction by the House Ethics Committee for failure to comply with lawful subpoenas. Mr. Chairman, we understand the gravity of each and every referral we are making today, just as we understand the magnitude of the crime against democracy that we describe in our report. But we have gone where the facts and the law lead us, and inescapably, they lead us here. Accordingly, Mr. Chairman, in light of these facts, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be directed to transmit to the United States Department of Justice relevant Select Committee records in furtherance of these criminal referrals.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to notice, I now call up Select Committee's final report pursuant to Section 4A of House Resolution 503. The clerk shall designate the report.
Final report of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
Without objection, the report will be considered read and open to amendment at this point. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Luria, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report to the House the Select Committee's final report, which includes the committee's legislative recommendations and criminal referrals of Donald J. Trump and others, pursuant to Section 4A of House Resolution 503.
The question is on the motion to favorably report to the House. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Cheney?
Aye.
Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren, aye. Mr. Schiff?
Aye.
Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Aguilar?
Aye.
Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mrs. Murphy?
Aye.
Mrs. Murphy, aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Mrs. Luria?
Aye.
Mrs. Luria, aye. Mr. Kinzinger?
Kinzinger, aye.
Mr. Kinzinger, aye.
How is the chair recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 9 ayes and 0 noes.
The motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any necessary technical or conforming changes to the report to reflect the actions of the committee. The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. There being no further business, without objection, the Select Committee stands adjourned.
And with that, a committee that has been credited with having a flair for the theatrical has ended its final public presentation with what is essentially a cliffhanger. The committee voting unanimously to refer criminal charges to the Department of Justice against President Trump. Charges that include obstructing an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the government, conspiracy to make a false statement, and inciting or assisting an insurrection. But those referrals have no legal bearing. It is now up to the DOJ whether or not to pursue those charges or even acknowledge them. The committee also voted to adopt their final report, and just moments ago they made the 100-page executive summary of it public. In it, the committee states their blunt conclusion that the central cause of January 6 was one man, former President Donald Trump, who many others followed. One of the events of January 6 would have happened none, we should say, would have happened without him. Let's go straight to our senior Capitol Hill correspondent, Garrett Hake. Garrett, we saw a few new witness statements from faces we had not seen in this prior, but in general, is this what we expected today?
Yeah, Lester, largely a summation of the committee's arguments up to this point. Some new evidence, as you pointed out, the former Trump advisor, Hope Hicks, for example, appearing on video, the first time we have heard from her in the committee's proceedings. But again, the news here today is the criminal referrals and the evidence that will come along with them. The committee making their argument after long effort to put together a rationale behind this to refer the former president on multiple counts, including obstruction of an official proceeding, referring, of course, to to the transfer of power, the counting of those votes on January 6th. In their report, the committee writes, President Trump acted with a corrupt purpose. Vice President Pence, Greg Jacob, and others repeatedly told the president that the vice president had no unilateral authority to prevent certification of the election. And Lester, I think that was one of the through points really for this committee. I covered both the impeachment of Donald Trump around January 6th and the committee's work. And one of the things that they did uncover that the impeachment managers never had when they made their case to the Senate was Donald Trump's state of mind and the information he was getting from his own attorneys, his campaign staffers, his inner circle, telling him that he had lost the election and that his comments were false. It's one of the things that the committee took great pains to try to establish, both for the public record and to provide the legal justifications for these referrals that they unveiled today.
And Garrett, when will we see the full report? When will that become public?
The committee is expecting to get the full report, or at least the bulk of it, out by Wednesday. You heard the chairman say that all non-sensitive materials, not clear what that distinction is going to mean here exactly, that they hope to have released by the end of the year. Remember, the committee wants to get all of their transcripts out, in part to show the full breadth of their investigation, in part to make them available to the Department of Justice, and in part to push back against Republican claims that they somehow cherry-picked evidence or ignored counterfactuals that would have undermined the case that they have put together about Donald Trump's culpability in the attack on the Capitol.
All right, let's bring in our justice correspondent, Ken Delaney. And so, Ken, these referrals have been made. We've repeated many times, non-binding. There's no legal weight to them. Clearly, though, the DOJ knew that this day was a possibility, that there would be referrals. Have they given any signal as to how they will receive them when they come in officially?
Yes, Lester, the main signal they're giving us is that they are not going to take them into consideration. They really want to maintain their independence in this investigation. Jack Smith, the special counsel, issued a statement upon his appointment in November saying that he will investigate this case independently. And that's a really important principle for them. Of course, the evidence that was produced by this congressional investigation, some of which we saw powerfully laid out today, will very much factor into the Department of Justice investigation. In fact, DOJ officials have been clamoring for months to get hold of all the transcripts of all the interviews that the January 6th committee has done, and there was a dispute, and the committee was not prepared to hand them over. Now they say they're going to release them, and that will be greeted warmly in Justice Department circles. And I think it's just important to remember that as powerful a case as we saw put on today, it's one side. It includes hearsay evidence. It includes the kind of evidence that the Department of Justice won't be able to bring into court. On the other hand, though, the DOJ has powerful tools that are not available to the committee. For example, when you saw former White House counsel Pat Cipollone refusing to answer questions about his conversations with the president, he won't be able to do that in front of a criminal grand jury. So there's a lot of information the DOJ will be able to gather about these facts and circumstances that the committee was not able to gather. But another interesting aspect of this is in addition to the criminal referrals for Donald Trump, John Eastman, the law professor who is advising Donald Trump, also named explicitly by the committee, and we know that he's been under federal criminal investigation.
All right, Ken, I'll ask you to stand by. Joining us now is former FBI General Counsel and NBC News legal analyst Andrew Weissman and NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalas. Andrew, let me begin with you. I guess my question is, does the Justice Department have more in terms of time working on this? I think there was a perception over the summer as we watched these hearings that this committee was much far advanced of the DOJ. Do we know that to be a fact?
We don't know that for sure, but I think that the betting public and us insiders are that's correct. In fact, part of the reason there was such tension between members of the committee and the Department of Justice was the feeling by people on the committee as to where is DOJ? Why weren't they doing more? It's very unusual for Congress to be out ahead of the department. I do think with the appointment of Jack Smith, though, you're really really seeing the department step up to the plate. And obviously, as Ken pointed out, the turning over of thousands of witness statements and transcripts and all of that evidence is going to be incredibly useful, both to the government and frankly also to Donald Trump to see what the evidence is and what he might be able to propose. So that is really going to be, from the Department of Justice's point of view and from Donald Trump's point of view, the real import here. Less the referrals and more about the actual evidence that is going to be disclosed.
Danny, does this panel, does this committee have more witness statements, more information than the Justice Department?
That is a tough question. It would seem that they've developed a lot that we didn't even hear about. But DOJ does not give updates on their investigations. So they may have a treasure chest of evidence and information, maybe even more than the January 6th committee amassed, if such a thing is possible. But don't forget, Merrick Garland made a point, and this is someone who is not fond of taking the podium and making public statements, but Merrick Garland came out and said, this is one of, and I'm paraphrasing, the most expansive investigations ever conducted. So I think you can reasonably assume that they have used their tools, which are far superior to the January 6th committee's tools. The Justice Department can use things like cooperating witnesses. They can offer deals. They can do things that the January 6th committee would only dream of in inducing people to turn over evidence. So while I think they will welcome the evidence provided by the January 6th committee, it's a pretty safe bet they've got plenty of evidence of their own.
Andrew, will they, in fact, welcome this information, or does it make the Department of Justice's job just a little harder? Does it not increase the tint or the persona of politics here?
I think that's a hard question, because you have to remember, from Congress's perspective, this is what they do. I myself, when I was in the department, would get referrals from Congress, whether I was on the Enron case or the special counsel investigation, where they would refer matters which they thought rose to a criminal level. So it does happen. And so what they're doing here is consistent with their practice. And I actually think for them not to do so would have had real ramifications as well. The sort of taint of politics, I think that is something that frankly was going to be inevitable whether or not the January 6th committee made these referrals. You can be sure that Donald Trump is going to say the department and Jack Smith are political. So I think it's probably the better course that Congress just stuck to what their normal practice is here. And now the department will have to stick to its normal practice, which is to make an independent judgment about whether the evidence rises to the level that it's appropriate to bring a criminal case. One final thought is that the thing that will make this harder is that all of this evidence is now available to the defense. That is very unusual. It is usually only after there is a criminal charge that this much evidence would be available to the defense. So this gives an opportunity to Donald Trump and his allies to pick apart that evidence and to potentially obstruct justice.
Andrew and Danny, thank you. Let me bring in Yamiche Alcindor, a Washington correspondent for NBC. Yamiche, I think people will stand back now and look at what this committee did, look at these referrals, and perhaps ask themselves, what did they want to do? What did they want to accomplish? So I'll ask you that question and whether they were able to accomplish it.
Well, Lester, what this committee set out to accomplish was this idea that they wanted to speak to history and to the American people to say that this was not okay, that January 6th wasn't spontaneous, but in fact a malicious, they think, plan by the former president. And Jamie Raskin really underscored it when he said this: ours is a system where ours is not a system where the people who, the foot soldiers, they go to jail, but the ringleaders and masterminds, they get a free pass. Jamie Raskin said that's just not the way our system works. And he's basically saying you can't have hundreds of people, these protesters, these rioters going to jail and not have a system where former President Trump and the people around him, that they don't also get criminal penalty for what they think they did, this dangerous plot that they say they hatched. So I think it's really important when you look at sort of the everyday impact of this committee. It was him speaking in plain language there, saying this is what we wanted to do to make
Sometimes the news can be difficult and overwhelming for kids to understand, so we've created a newscast just for them. We hope your family will watch Nightly News Kids Edition.
Watch NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt or listen wherever you get your podcasts. Celebrating 75 years of Meet the Press, the longest running show on television. For Dateline Premium, subscribe now.